Welcome back for another impactful episode of the PSTA podcast. I'm your favorite host.
The best. For the record, that was not a built-in sound effect. Craig made that all by himself.
I did, Patrick. Well, before we get started, highly debatable Teacher Appreciation Week. Some are saying it's this week. Some are saying it's next week. Patrick, what do you think?
I mean, I think that teachers deserve to just be celebrated all the time. So whether you observe this week or next week, just observe them both. You deserve it. And also understand this is why education policy is so darn confusing, because we can't even figure out which week is Teacher Appreciation Week.
That is just the funniest thing. But teachers should be celebrated every day of the week, every year. It just doesn't matter. But anyway, we appreciate all of our teachers and all the hard work that you do. And speaking of teachers, tomorrow I want to give a big shout out to Chesterfield County Teacher Forum, who will be visiting the State House for their Legislative Hill Day. Excited to have them up tomorrow. So shout out to them. And then next week we'll have Sumter attending during the last week of session. Patrick, I can't believe it's here.
It's here. And shout out to Sumter for showing up the last week. I mean, you want to see how the sausage gets made, next week's it.
Well, they're dedicated. I let them know that. I said, hey, this is the last week of session. You're more than happy to still come up. And they're like, let's do it. Let's go for it. And so I'm excited to have them next weweek. But Patrick, how you doing?
I'm doing great.
Yeah. Well, what's on the agenda for today? You got your running clothes on. What's going on today?
Well, I'm going to leave here and I'm going to go put on my third hat and I'm going to go coach some kids in track, which is a lot easier than the other hats. So I will not be wearing this athletic apparel to the State House tomorrow.
Good deal. Well, let's get to it so we can get you out of here. So what's going on at General Assembly? 2 weeks left in the session. What can we expect?
This is crunch time. In a lot of ways, this is kind of like in a sporting event. If you've got the team that is 20 points down in basketball with 15 minutes to play, they start throwing everything they can at the wall. That's where the General Assembly is at, not necessarily because they're behind, quote unquote, but just because they don't have a whole lot of time left. And so it is going to be a busy next 2 weeks. It's going to be an anything goes next 2 weeks. You can make a lot of prognostications about what is or is not going to happen. But the surest thing is that the only thing you know is that you know nothing with 2 weeks to go in the General Assembly, other than they're going to be busy.
Yeah. So. Oh, that was very loud, Patrick.
That's all right, because it was that deep of a thought that you were about to jump into.
Not really. I just want to ask, so crossover date has crossed. Done. So what are some of the pieces of legislation that didn't quite make it, that we thought were going to make it, that we,
honestly, most of the bills that we were looking at made crossover deadline. The key is that a lot of bills then didn't make it out of committee. So the lottery scholarship enhancement that the Senate passed, that is a big priority for us, for education majors to get the same enhancement on their lottery scholarships that math and science majors get. That made it from the Senate to the House prior to the crossover deadline, but it just didn't get enough time in the House. And there were a couple bills that went the other direction that had the same outcome. And really, that's just a feature of the fact that the crossover deadline is over halfway into a session. So when that deadline hit in early April, there weren't a lot of weeks left to begin with. And on the Senate side in particular, it gets crunched because they still have their budget to take up at that point. So there's a lot of bills that are still sitting out there that will be starting next January in the opposite chamber that they were in this year, like the lottery enhancement scholarship. So that's exciting because they'll be that much closer to getting passed. But there's a couple bills that can actually make it to the governor's desk before the session's out.
So from an advocacy standpoint, we know weekly our members, even those in Alaska, if we do have any, receive that legislative update. What are some action items that teachers can take part in these last 2 weeks to push anything across the line?
Well, to date, the only core education-related bill that's made it to the governor's desk is S39, the bill that created education scholarship accounts in South Carolina. As of the time we're recording this, the governor hadn't signed it yet, but he has said he's going to sign it. But there are a couple of bills that are still pending that could make it to the finish line. Number one is H 3908, which would provide paid parental leave to educators. That is sitting on the Senate calendar. And that, if passed by the Senate, there's some technical amendments the Senate made, but I think the House would easily concur with those amendments. And so paid parental leave could make it to the governor. And I would encourage all educators and supporters of education and supporters of families to be reaching out to their legislators asking for that bill to move. The S418 is the bill that would overhaul Read to Succeed recertification requirements. It's passed the Senate. It's now on the House calendar. And if passed by the House, could make it to the governor. Now, that one's a little messier because the House Education Committee substantially amended that bill. What the Senate passed was just an update to the Read to Succeed certification requirements, those courses that teachers have had to take over the last decade. The House kept that language, but then added a sweeping overhaul of the entire literacy program in Read to Succeed in terms of what can be in the curriculum and what cannot be. Who's eligible for summer reading camps? Who's eligible for additional interventions in reading based on how they do on early literacy screeners? So it is a comprehensive piece of legislation, and so it's a little less clear what will the Senate do with that bill if they get this House version coming to them. The one other bill that has a realistic chance of making it to the governor's desk is H 3728, the Transparency and Integrity in Education Act. It passed the House a couple months ago now. It is now sitting on the Senate calendar. It is on the contested calendar, which means a senator has put their name on the bill, which means it is not eligible for debate in front of all bills that are not contested. But there is a strong likelihood that before the Senate adjourns next Thursday, May the 11th, that they will set the bill for special order, which is basically a procedural motion in the Senate that means that it must be debated before all other contested bills, which would give it time to be debated before the end of session. But again, that hasn't happened yet. As of the time of this recording, the headwinds seem to be that it will get set for special order. But again, like I said, the only thing you know with 2 weeks to go is that you don't know anything. And there are a lot of other bills and a lot of other topics that have nothing to do with education that will also be jockeying for special order status in the Senate.
So there is some work for you to do, teachers. You know, Patrick went over the 3 bills that have the capability of being passed, some of which you will support and some of which you may not. And so that paid parental leave and that Read to Succeed, while Read to Succeed is a little messy, and do we see that possibly going to a conference committee if it gets sent back over with changes?
I think it's almost certain that it would go to conference committee because whereas the paid parental leave amendments were technical, they were simply like saying instead of the bill going into effect upon signature of the governor, it goes into effect 45 days after he signs it. I don't see that being substantive enough that the House would request a conference. Those updates to S418, the Read to Succeed bill, you're really talking about almost 2 pieces of different legislation at this point. I would envision that would be a conference committee. The Senate could just concur, and at that point it goes straight to the governor. But generally, when you see that big of a discrepancy in the House and Senate version of a bill, you're going to be looking at a conference committee of representatives and senators to come up with a unified version for both chambers to approve.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that update, Patrick. So take a look at your legislative update, see how you can get involved just by clicking on those links that Patrick has listed in his email. I do want to make note of something important coming up, teacher contracts. So make sure that you have your teacher contract. If you still have it in hand, you have until before May 11th, which is May 10th, which is also the last day of session.
May 11th is the last day.
May 11th is the last day of session. So next Wednesday, May 10th is the last day to turn in your teacher contract. So make sure that you do that.
And let me say one thing about contracts. If people have been following our Legislative Alert Network emails closely, you've noticed H 4280, the Educator Assistance Act that was introduced by Chair Erickson. That bill is on the House calendar, and it has a very strong chance of passing the House in the next 2 weeks. And that bill does deal with contracts. One of the core provisions of that bill would give teachers a 10-day period from the date their district posts their salary schedule to withdraw an accepted contract without penalty. So really what that means in a practical sense, state statute, as Craig just pointed out, requires teachers to sign that contract by May 11th. But I'm not aware, May 10th, by 11:59 p.m. on May the 10th. So have it signed prior to the calendar flipping to May 11th.
Right.
I'm not aware of any district that posts their final salary schedule by that time because the General Assembly hadn't finished their budget by that time. And so teachers are effectively the only profession I'm aware of in South Carolina that signs a contract without knowing what your salary is going to be.
Right.
And so I know a lot of members have been interested in that 10-day withdrawal without penalty component of H4280. I can say with 100% certainty, H4280 is not becoming law this year because it is not going to have time to make it from the House to the Senate, even if the Senate wanted to pull it straight to the floor with a unanimous consent vote. There's not enough time. There's too many other things on the Senate calendar. So if you are interested in that, then of course, ask your representative to pass it, but be ready to advocate for it next January in the Senate. But do not bank on that being the law of South Carolina come June or July. We are going to be operating under the existing teacher contract statute for the remainder of 2023.
Got it. Well, Patrick, thank you for joining us once again. Our favorite guest. Seems like our only guest, I know, but Patrick's great. Yeah. But this has been another impactful episode of the PSTA podcast. I'm Craig King, your host. I'll see you next time.